This map illustrates the staggering geographic reality of King Xerxes' ancient regime. Stretching across 127 provinces, from India all the way to Ethiopia, his throne in Susa commanded absolute, terrifying authority over the known world. To display that dominance, Xerxes hosted a lavish 180-day feast for his military leaders and nobles. The royal wine flowed endlessly from golden goblets, feeding a culture of extreme wealth and unchecked drunken excess. When his own queen, Vashti, refused to parade herself before a drunken crowd, the king's wounded pride demanded immediate retaliation. A royal edict was issued across every province, stripping Vashti of her crown and banishing her simply to protect the king's ego. To replace her, young women were gathered from every corner of the empire. Among them was Hadassah, a powerless Jewish orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai. Taken to the palace, she adopted the Persian name Esther and carefully kept her heritage and her faith a complete secret. Living under a regime where a single bruised ego can destroy your life in an instant, marginalized people learn very quickly that survival often depends on wearing a mask. Esther's quiet dignity captivated the king, and he placed the royal crown on her head. But even as queen, she remained isolated behind palace walls, holding title without true political leverage. Meanwhile, Xerxes promoted an official named Haman to the highest rank in the empire. Haman was a man consumed by his own status, and when Mordecai refused to bow to him at the king's gate, Haman burned with a violent, obsessive anger. Punishing one man wasn't enough. Haman used deceitful words to convince the king that the entire Jewish population was a dangerous, non-compliant threat to the state, manipulating Xerxes into authorizing a mass extermination. The king handed over his signet ring, and couriers immediately carried the decree outward. Under Persian law, once a document was sealed with that ring, the order to slaughter the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month became legally binding and impossible to revoke. When supreme authority operates without empathy, administrative bureaucracy inevitably becomes a highly efficient weapon of mass destruction. As the edict spread, Susa fell into confusion. Mordecai wept bitterly, wearing sackcloth and ashes, while Esther sat sheltered, unaware of the slaughter. When she learned the truth, she faced a terrifying legal barrier. Approaching the inner court unsummoned meant automatic death, unless the king extended his scepter. Mordecai sent a sharp message to the palace, warning her that silence offers no escape. He challenged her to consider that she was elevated to royalty for exactly this moment, for such a time as this. After calling for 3 days of fasting, her fear gave way to resolve. She chose to risk the executioner, declaring she would go to the king, adding, "If I perish, I perish." True courage is never the absence of fear. It is the conscious, willing acceptance of your own destruction in order to speak for those who cannot. Dressed in her royal robes, Esther stepped into the inner court. The king extended the golden scepter, sparing her life. But instead of pleading for her people right then, she carefully delayed her request, inviting Xerxes and Haman to a private banquet. Looking at this cuneiform script, you see the massive volume of Persian records. That night, a restless Xerxes ordered servants to read these chronicles. Buried within was a forgotten entry. Mordecai uncovered an assassination plot against the king, an act of loyalty left completely unrewarded. In brilliant irony, Haman entered the palace that morning to ask permission to hang Mordecai. Before Haman spoke, the king ordered him to personally clothe Mordecai in royal robes and lead his enemy through the city streets in absolute honor. The universe often turns on the smallest of hinges. A delayed conversation and a random sleepless night can perfectly dismantle a tyrant's master plan. At the second banquet, with the king's favor secured, Esther finally dropped her carefully maintained mask. She revealed her heritage, begging the king to spare her and her people from an impending slaughter. When a shocked Xerxes demanded to know who would dare plot such a thing, Esther pointed directly at her guest and named Haman as the adversary and enemy, sending the king into an explosive rage. Haman's terror was absolute. He was seized by the king's guards and swift executed on the towering gallows he had just constructed to destroy Mordecai. But a massive geopolitical problem remained. Haman was dead, yet his legally binding decree to annihilate the Jews was still active. Because Persian law could not be revoked, Esther had to plead for a secondary counter-decree, granting her people the legal right to assemble and defend themselves. Simply removing the architect of a corrupted system is never enough. True justice requires actively empowering the vulnerable with the right to fight back. Armed with royal protection, the Jewish people stood united and defeated their attackers across the empire. What was scheduled as a day of dread was permanently reversed into Purim, a yearly festival celebrating survival, charity, and life. Mordecai was elevated to second in command under King Xerxes, but his lasting greatness came from his heart, as he used his new authority to seek the good and peace of his people, rather than his own glory. There is a profound literary irony built into the Book of Esther. It is the only book in the text where God's name is completely absent, yet through the invisible orchestration of every twist and rescue, his presence is undeniable. It challenges us to consider our own positions. Even when the silence feels deafening, you are not standing where you are by accident. When the odds are completely stacked against you, an ordinary person's quiet bravery might be the exact mechanism designed, for such a time as this, to write a story of redemption.